Alrighty, hello and welcome back to part two of the civilizational history of the witness. In part one, we talked about the ancient proto-civilization in the desert, and then the medieval people with their kind of religious orientation towards the world, and who kind of came to the island, some kind of Christian influence and stuff, like people coming and going, doing trade, building a real town, having like an economy, stuff like that. But now we're going to talk about the industrial civilization, and who have a bit more of a story to them. But we're also, unlike in the real world where industrial civilization was obviously like the fastest growing of anything, it's only like a little outpost, like there's not like a giant office tower in the middle of the island or anything. So that's sort of interesting. We're going to talk about who those people were and kind of what they're all about. And they have a bit more of a specific story. And then we're going to talk about the final and fourth level of civilization in the game, which is the kind of like futuristic, like sci-fi super civilization that the industrial civilization eventually grows into, which is important. It's one continuous group of people, but it's important because it's like going from where we are now to like an aspirational future of like where humanity could go and what kinds of things we might build or understand in the future. So to get started, I mean, just architecturally, there's a lot of differences. Obviously, the industrial people, they're laying all this concrete and stuff, which has this kind of weird texture to it because of the way it's been molded. Everything metal. They're the ones seemingly who put the panels up everywhere, although there's different phases to the industrial civilization that are a little bit more noticeable than the medieval civilization, where it's hard to tell what came first and what came later. But we'll just walk through here. So we've got like crushed up, like earlier this would be like carved into blocks to build this stone church, but then that became disused. And then when the industrial civilization showed up, and notably, like the medieval civilization kind of disappeared, rather than there being a smooth evolution. It's like actually, let me read the wacky text from the architects, from that blog post. They say, the current state of the islands speaks to a destruction event which led to the abandonment of the previous civilization and a recent reoccupation of the island by a much smaller, modern population that brought with them a high technological sophistication. Many of the surviving structures on the previous civilization lie in ruin, though they have been reappropriated by contemporary inhabitants who have grafted new constructs onto these remnants. Recent uses include a factory for the production of high-quality goods, as well as a scientific observatory from the rim of the volcanic crater. A lone house has been constructed on a bluff that seems to have been the primary residence of an important actor on the island who oversaw much of its recent development. So again, that's an early draft. I'm not sure it's canon anymore that the medieval civilization was destroyed by Pompeii style by a volcano eruption. Nor is there like a house of like the creator of the game, the person who put all the panels. That used to be like a kind of concrete style bunker house that was in the middle of the fantasy castle, but then that was kind of taken away and replaced by the kind of future hotel architecture in the fantasy castle. So there no longer is like the house of the creator god guy. But the Witness used to have a more personal sort of Bioshock style story where there were like characters and they got into arguments and did stuff, stuff like that. But anyways, here's just concrete factory. You see some of these panels have this more like curved CRT style.
I feel like these are the first ones. These are the earlier panels.
yeah, kind of an earlier look. And then something like the glass factory is like on the symmetry side of the island has this same general thing of like steel and then like iron panels on top. Actually, you know what? This is from the ship. They're recasting. All this metal has that same kind of orange. It's just like sheet iron metal from the ship. I've noticed that before in like the places where it's more obvious, but anyways, so that leads into the specific story of like who were these industrial people, why did they come here? Because it wasn't just a smooth development. This island was mostly abandoned, presumably because it was so remote, and then it was kind of re-inhabited, but not as a society-wide, not by the mainstream, only as a kind of scientific outpost. And I think this is kind of almost like a political commentary or just like a social commentary on the fact that modern society has kind of abandoned some of the big questions that these medieval people were paying more attention to. So you guys remember this on the boat? There's this very memorable audio log from like C.K. Chesterton or something like that, talking about the ship owner and the immigrants who got on the boat because they wanted to go to a new land like America or something, but the ship owner hadn't checked out his ship properly, and he kind of convinced himself, sort of deluded himself into thinking that it was fine when really he should have known better. And then, like, whose fault is it that he wasn't rational enough, or, was too biased, or things like that. But given that it's on a literal wrecked ship, I guess I take this pretty literally. Like this is a big modern era ship, versus the story seems like it's kind of should be about like a caravel from like the 1700s or something, like carrying pilgrims or whatever. So this is like a modern day container ship, very like unromantic utilitarian kind of shape, even though it's been twisted and corroded into this like really beautiful abstract form, with all these awesome puzzles in it. And I kind of take that, like, maybe the immigrant story is like literally like there were some people who wanted to move to the island, and then the boat hit the thing and sank. Yeah. And I also think like just when I listen to the audio logs that are like society of true searchers with few living members at any time, and this attitude of almost like persecution and like forgottenness, or like the Rupert Spira audio log that's in the ship, like these people, again, this is kind of me spinning a crackpot theory, but just go with it. These people were like, they were bringing that Rupert Spira video. That's like the thing that was in their most sacred thing. And Rupert Spira he's not like an actual like, Hindu guru or something. I mean, he's like an actual spiritual teacher. But what I'm saying is like, he's not like in some ancient religious tradition. Like, I'm sure the witness could have found some guy who was like just hardcore, like, yeah, I've received the koan transmission from like the Red Pine School or something, or like I'm an Advaita Vedanta teacher in like, who graduated from like this religious Brahmin college where we learned all about the nature of Atman and stuff. Instead, Rupert Spira, although he's learned from Advaita Vedanta and stuff like that, he has his own kind of modern day, almost secular, even though he's like the most spiritual person I could imagine, like kind of like new school rational inquiry. He's like kind of DIYing, the Buddhist attitude of like just look to your own experience, rederive things, and is representing sort of like a rediscovery by like modern secular culture, modern Western culture, of those truths about consciousness and attention, and just like paying attention to your own experience. So I almost feel like these people, like, they kind of got that lesson, and they wanted to be the Society of True Searchers, and they were like, hey, there was this island that was like Athens or something, and it had like, it had all these ancient philosophers. They made all this progress and stuff, but then they wither away because whatever, the economics of the island declined. But like, we're gonna like go out there and like start a intentional community, like utopian commune of true philosophers or something, and do our thing, and then maybe we'll be able to like kind of isolate. It's almost like Rapture from BioShock or something, only for like doing philosophy in the modern world instead of being libertarian. So like, yeah, so all these people are like coming here because they feel almost exiled from the outside world. And again, there's not that much to support that, but
that's your headcanon.
It's my headcanon. It's kind of like a resonant image for me. But then the ship crashes, and they have a hard time. I kind of picture the origin of the tree houses as almost being like refugee housing or something. Like it doesn't make sense with the fact that it's built all super abstract. But you want to make it pretty and not make it look totally ramshackle. So So I almost kind of picture them like, okay, like crashed. They're like shit. You know, they're like building a little camp here as they kind of like drag supplies and stuff from the wreckage of the thing. And then they're like dragging these freaking containers all over the island. Like they've got this little bit of scraped metal here, which of course represents the boat itself, because this whole thing is like a map of the island, right? So the leftover boat stuff represents the actual ship. But anyways, they have some scraped off metal there. They have the the sheet metal that's used in the retaining thing. There's one of the containers shows up deep in the forest, right? And it contains that quote about Zen physics or something. Then there's other containers that end up in the town. They just start using them architecturally to like fix things up and build stuff. And so that's kind of how I see is like the first steps of the industrial civilization. But then eventually they kind of get back on their feet. They build that concrete factory. They dam up the river to create this lake. They start excavating stuff and doing investigations of things. They start doing science. They build the marsh area and then the color bunker. And they kind of do like archaeology on all this, so all the scaffolding and kind of restoration-y, like reusing the buildings in multiple ways kind of things, is all by the modern day folks. Let's see. I guess we'll check out the glass factory. So the glass factory is interesting because this starts getting into the meta story of like they're literally making the infrastructure to build the panel puzzles, because it can kind of seem like, well, like, are the panels real in the lore of the game? Because who would just build a bunch of puzzles, And actually, we'll get to that in a very totally wacky conspiratorial part of the video in a little bit. Oh my god, how do you get up to that little trail? Is there just a little thing here? Oh yeah, okay. But anyway, so the glass factory is another sort of, this is like the industrial civilization has now like built its way up Maslow's hierarchies of needs. They've come back from the ship catastrophe, although they're still using the same metal harvested from the ship.
Good material.
Yeah, to make their stuff. And they're now like doing art and stuff. They're not just like setting up their economy.
Just procuring shelter on
Yeah. So, this never even occurred to me, but of course you need glass to make sand. They have the sand here, so they're like dredging it up or something, and then they got piles of sand, and then they're like smelting it. They're actually making the glass. They're not just shaping it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of cool. But anyway, so that's sort of like the physical imprint of the modern society. It's the most prevalent on the island, even though it's not as charismatic as all the medieval era stuff.
Yeah, in fact, it's almost like painfully uncharismatic.
Yeah. It's kind of too utilitarian or modernist, but
with the exception of like the marble statues, that's like the only kind of actually nice
yeah
thing they made.
And it's kind of a funny mix of like caring for the past by like doing all this careful restoration type stuff, but then also like draping wacky wires all over it and just like repurposing buildings as concrete factories and like like just freaking like busting open giant ass holes in the ground to like just go like dig for things, like it's a little weird. I don't know. So that's the modern civilization for you, kind of a world of paradoxes. But they obviously represent. I mean, I don't know. There's a bunch of things to say here. Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of ups and downs about industrial society. I mean, mostly ups, of course, from the perspective of like material prosperity and stuff. But this is the witness. So we're more thinking about like seeking truth, right? And from that perspective, still, the modern industrial scientific perspective has a ton of advantages. Even, if you're not paying attention to like antibiotics and like hot showers and stuff. So most importantly, we have like science. We have the real scientific method of like Galileo and people like that. This incredibly powerful tool for finding stuff out about the world, and it can make things tractable, right? So I was saying in my previous episode that it kind of made sense for people back in the day to spend their time thinking about big questions about philosophy and God, because it was like equally intractable to them, like the mysteries of biology and the mysteries of like metaphysics. And we figured out that actually you can do experiments and make tons of progress on biology, and you can build like a shared paradigm of understanding, and then everyone can like build on that iteratively, piece by piece. Like you can just study like one weird thing about like one bacteria or like some lemur that lives in some forest somewhere, and that can like contribute to the whole picture in a way that like all these different philosophers, they're all writing commentaries on each other's work, but it's so difficult to communicate like the deepest aspects of that understanding, versus the deepest aspects of understanding of like material science or something. Like, yeah, you have to go to grad school, but like you can read the textbooks, you can get to the frontier. There's going to be some tacit knowledge that you don't understand until a decade into your career or something, but like it's so much more tractable. And that is kind of the power of the scientific method, is like it's really important. It must have seemed kind of absurd back in the day, like why should I document my experiment? I just do experiments by like just life. Like I observe stuff, I think about things, I try things sometimes. But it's like, no, you gotta like write things up, you gotta tell people about it. You have to have a culture of like explaining how you did something, being like reasoning transparency.
Right, and also it'd be like so unclear that like studying the insects would be something that would be valuable, whereas like thinking about morality is like obviously valuable. You should do that so much.
Exactly. Back in the day, people were like, theology is the queen of the sciences, because it's the most important topic, and it still kind of is the most important topic. Except that like we can't make any progress on it. And it turns out that even if you study freaking beetles, like eventually you can get some promising results from even studying unexpected, like seemingly trivial things. So anyways, the method of science is just incredibly powerful and lets us parallelize the process of discovery and turn this thing that was really, even though the previous people had this awareness that they were in history and they were building things for the long term and they're passing down knowledge like in a monastery, it's kind of an individual quest. And then in our world, it's like things have gone from serial to parallel in a way, and you can just make so much more progress on so many different things. And then secondly, separate from the method of science, we have like the fruits of science. Like we have like microscopes and stuff. We have all this knowledge. We're really like standing on the shoulders of giants. And even when we do philosophy, which upon which we still can't make any progress, but really we can, because we understand all these things, like about the brain, about like the solar system, like even if you're trying to
society, like they used to think that like there was one individual and that would like determine the course of history, and now we're like, no, like,
or just like for thinking about humans' place in the universe, like it might seem like, well, it's kind of irrelevant what the details of astronomy are, but it's like actually it is kind of relevant. If you think that the Earth is at the center, that supports a bunch of ideas about like humans being really the center of the story, versus if you're just kind of like in this vast universe, then it's like, wow, why is it so big? Like, are there others out there? It seems like we're just like by accident. And same thing, if you think the universe was around forever, as was a scientific opinion in like the 1800s, that's different from thinking that it had a beginning. Just having these things, it does start to inform, even if it doesn't answer, the biggest philosophical questions. And when you learn about science, when you learn about why human values are the way we are, people would wonder like, well, like, where did love come from? Like what, like all these kinds of things. And like, it's like, well, if you learn about evolutionary biology, you can start to actually like understand that stuff. And it doesn't answer all the questions, but you feel like, there's like a valuable understanding that's happening. You feel more grounded.
There's some context and there's
some
where
you
limits. Like you have to, like when you're talking about love, you have to also accommodate all the other things we've discovered,
And it's funny because the biggest philosophical questions are the ones that are unanswered. So it's like if I knew what town I was in, but not what nation I was in. It's like I'm in Fort Collins, but I'm not sure if I'm in the United States or Russia or like Indonesia. Or,
that's really what it feels like.
But that's still, it's still something, And
we've limited some stuff. So now that we know we're in Fort Collins,
Yeah.
We could be in Russia or we could be in the United States, but we're
probably not in the
Indonesia.
tropics. Yeah. So it's
but we could be in some rare circumstances. So it's still
So just standing on the shoulders of giants in that way and having the fruits of science is really valuable. But there's also one of the drawbacks of this is like our current paradigm is so powerful that it can be easy to just kind of write off people who lived before, assume that they were like somehow dumb, or that like that they just that their paradigm was like so wrong. Yeah, like they couldn't have anything to contribute to the modern world, so that's kind of a shortcoming, and that creates this kind of unwillingness to listen. This is, I think, kind of what The Witness is saying by its emphasis on
through, like in the architecture and the stuff that we're building. It's like, yes, it's impressive, but like, look how lacking.
Yeah. There's kind of like a spiritual poverty, or like it's like just materialism, a little bit too nose to the grindstone. Like, hey, I'm just studying this bacteria. I'm not thinking about the big questions. Even politically, in a certain sense, like nations used to fight real wars around like what to believe and stuff, which has a lot of downsides. Like people basically didn't have freedom of thought back in the day, and when you listen to a lot of these audio logs, they can't really debate like if there's God or not. Some people did do that, like the Mughal Empire had these famous debates between like Buddhists and Christians and Muslims and stuff like that, but
cool.
It's cool, but it's cool because of how rare it was. And these people writing, they're almost so immersed in a homogenous society that they can't see beyond certain things, even when they in other ways have such deep depth of thought. They kind of seem like they're writing out of their time. It's like a shame that Nicholas of Cusa like couldn't communicate with these other people very effectively. It's
now we have all these books and we can read
people
and listen
like
to
it's romantic to think about like the conversation across generations, but like that literally means that you get to comment on Socrates and he never gets to reply to you because he's dead. And the next great thinker doesn't come along until 2 centuries later. But anyways, like on a nation state level, like countries used to be founded, they used to have this idea that like we knew what the good life was and we were just going to make people do that because we knew what the purpose of civilization was. Was like to praise God or to come closely embody the kingdom of heaven or something. But then we got into all these horrible religious wars on it, like the 30 Years' War, which is like one of the worst wars in European history. And then everyone was like, okay, we can't do this anymore. Like, we have the printing press, people are reading their own shit, they're disagreeing. We have to just agree to disagree, otherwise we'll just be genociding each other forever. And that was a good decision. But it's kind of, as a result, like, the modern liberal paradigm is like, sort of like, don't talk about it, Don't talk about the most important things. Yeah. And then that's become, again, due to the kind of opportunity cost stuff that I talked about earlier, like, it's become kind of, like it's not worth thinking about or something. So there's been a kind of societal forgetting. I mean, probably this is silly because obviously back in the day, like most people were just peasants in the fields. They weren't really thinking about the big questions. They were probably just annoyed that they were getting preached to so much by like corrupt officials. So probably the thoughtfulness level of society has not like objectively like hugely declined.
But I think to some degree, like we do kind of offload that and be like, well, I don't think about death. There's like other people out there, and it's their job to think about the big question.
And just like Jonathan Blow and friends have an audio log somewhere where they're talking about the difficulty of finding like thoughtful materialist perspectives from people who actually were like leading scientists and stuff. You find a lot of like atheist tirades about why like organized religion is dumb, but you don't find a lot of like genuine kind of
introspective
introspective like kind of just good quality thinking from and and that seems maybe symptomatic of like a society that's kind of abdicated on the biggest questions or kind of forgotten about them. And then, like I was saying, the modern society has kind of a short-term orientation, as perhaps symbolized by this bridge that we just like hastily reconstructed so that we could walk across it, but not trying to make it last 400 years or anything like that. So that's the kind of third civilization. Like I said, I think it's a more specific story of like people coming here feeling like they're exiles from that world of shallowness. They're like, we want to participate. We're scientists, we're modern people, like we're mostly atheistic, but we want to be seekers of truth and not just be sucked up in that shallowness and fast-pacedness of the modern world. So we're going to exile ourselves to this real slow-paced island and think about the big questions. So that's the third civilization. But then there's a fourth civilization, which is where that third civilization goes. And that is, in order for that to make sense, so this isn't mentioned in the architect's blogs because it's just kind of an extension of the third one, but I think it's an important part of the story. This is all of the kind of crazy magic technology, like the teleporter door, and super huge spoilers obviously, but this whole series is huge spoilers. The teleporter door in the intro castle that takes you to the like secret endgame flying hotel stuff, the flying Willy Wonka Vader from the traditional ending, the kind of normal ending of the game, or like the puzzle panel ending or something. All the lasers, of course, being gathered together as some kind of like energy focusing device. The light bridges inside the giant mountain layer, and the giant mountain layer itself. So we'll talk about this in more detail when we actually get to the mountain layer episode, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff about the future civilization now, but it would make this video even longer. And in particular, there's kind of a horror element. I mean, the mountain kind of is like an ominous presence. The architect's blog had some line, or maybe Luis's blog had some line about how it's supposed to symbolize death in a way, and even though it also symbolizes like the culmination of, it's like a confrontation with the ultimate, right? Which is like, has a good aspect, but also has a scary aspect, because it's this world of absolutes, right? Like what's the line about the great fishes or whatever, like the depths below are bottomless and the sky is like they're both infinitely far away, right? But anyways, like there's all this kind of ugly panels in the central area, which I think kind of represent like some of our anxieties about science, or some of the horrifying things that we might discover, or the ways that we might have to go to kind of extreme lengths, like almost like Nazi doctor experiments about the nature of consciousness, like split brain patients and stuff, in order to learn and understand. It's like it's cutting the rats' brains into pieces and putting posts into their minds and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's true. It does have that theme. I would almost say it's also the internal experience of having your world kind of like torn asunder as you consider like, well, maybe everything is not what I thought it was.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a return to like a Braid world of like the obsessive experimentation.
Yes.
And also the inaccessibility. Like this is like all gentle, but then this is kind of like, hey, like are you ready to bite the bullet if like the going gets weird? So that's,
and the kind of intense like discovery of stuff like all at once, or like in order to figure things out, like you have to be paying attention and like putting it together, as opposed to over here you're kind of like observing, living life, like noticing things. Yeah. So the lab area is, has a bunch of those themes, and it's really interesting, and it's kind of a transitional. So the different levels of tech, the lab area is kind of transitional because it's still a recognizable industrial civilization. Like they spent some number of $1 million to build the lab or whatever. Like it looks kind of normal, even though it looks like a portal test chamber, versus then the apotheosis of the fourth civilization is like the flying hotel stuff, where it's just like total magic, like they've hacked the simulation. And now some of you might are probably saying like, wait, no, like the hotel isn't part of the story of the people on the island. That's part of the VR story of like people were designing this game in order to, like people were designing the island like in a computer in order to enter it, and so then like the hotel is like the infrastructure for the people who are in the VR coma to like relax and enjoy the island, because it's sort of like historical tourism, but like you also need a place to sleep at night, and you're not just gonna rough it in the cathedral. But The Witness has many layers of story. And again, we'll talk about the VR story more in depth if I ever get to the blooper cave section with the area with the bonus puzzles. But like the VR story kind of blurs the boundaries between
like future people
Science
developing VR tech or like neural interface tech to promote enlightenment versus like the actual developers of The Witness just trying to develop a philosophically thoughtful video game about those themes. But also I think that the story of the island kind of blurs the lines between the VR story and the story of this civilization. So what I kind of see in like the teleporter thing and then the weird hotel airport ending, it's almost like they've like figured out the fabric of the universe and like escaped it or something. Like they built a portal to somewhere else, you know, and then or like something like that. Like they became some kind of super civilization and maybe they left to like colonize the stars or something, you know, like they it's like they kind of became so advanced that they like went to some other dimension or whatever, and the hotel ending is sort of a representative of that, like as if they might want to come back just like the people going into the coma, like and revisit their own history from the past or something, right. or like that was the transition point where they'd take like just ordinary monks and stuff from the town and be like, hey, like, you know, we're all migrating to this like new dimension or something, like here's the transition process you're going to go through, you know, like you're going to go through this teleport portal, you're going to go through a little transitional space, that kind of thing. So anyways, that's like the future super civilization, and I think that's important in the game for a few reasons. First of all, like I said, it blurs the line between the layers of fictionality of the story, which is a weird thing that the game is doing. I'm not like a huge fan of it even, because it is kind of weird, but it's interesting. It's like an alternative way to do narrative in a video game, and it tries to bring it into the real world a little bit by being like, this isn't like, it's fake, but it's not just literally a story about like Andrew Ryan and Shodan and stuff. It's like a story about, I don't know, humanity. It's like a metaphor world. There's like mixed levels of representation.
I think it's trying to, because like it's impossible to do a good job of imagining future tech. So it's just trying to like, you know, like this is where we came from, this is where we are, and then trying to imagine like where are we going, and it's just trying to put like a taste of that in there. And it can't do that literally, so it's just doing it metaphorically of like, well, maybe it'd be luxury, maybe every day would be like a day on vacation or something. Like it's just hard to imagine like what would our future be like to actually exist in it.
Yeah. So to be clear, like this kind of stuff is like the hotel world Easter eggs of like the future, like post-scarcity super civilization that's just sort of like vacationing and living the thoughtful life of the mind while like trying to become enlightened on this, you know, like it's so
doing whatever they want.
yeah. And then, I mean, this castle really has a lot of things going for it. Obviously, the fantasy castle is like medieval era. And then down here we have like a wine cellar, which was probably contemporaneous with that stuff. And then we have, this is more like the mountain type like lab. Like this is like science warp. Like you just got like teleported in from, you know, from like outer space or whatever. And you're gonna like experience, this is like the dimension warp portal or something, and it is maybe a little more primitive than the like super hotel stuff that shows up later, because maybe it was built relatively earlier, like, you know, right after the Mountain Lab finished all their research and figured out how to use the fundamental power of like consciousness in order to, you know, like astral travel or something.
Terraform, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyways, that's the fourth civilization. I really want to unleash this crazy, I wish I could find this crazy Reddit post where I got this idea from. So if anyone finds this, then repost it in the comments, because I would love to. I've tried to search, it was on like The Witness, you know, and I've tried to search for it, but I wasn't able to re-find it again. But somebody unleashed this absolutely whack conspiracy that I am totally here for. And it ties together, it makes the ideas of the super civilization work a little bit better at the expense of maybe making the entire story a lot dumber. So here, again, I wish I could just read this thing verbatim, but here's my summary of it. The idea is basically, what if the environmental, like, you know how I've been saying, like, are the panel puzzles like part of the history of the island, or are they like or are they like not really canon in the game, right? Like in a normal video game, like in like I don't know, like Assassin's Creed or something, like you're like going around like ancient Florence, and then there's also like floating light orbs, and then you pick up the light orbs and they like tell you something about the history of ancient Florence, you know? And it's like, okay, like Assassin's Creed isn't telling me that literal ancient Florence had floating light orbs. Like, that's just part of the game, you know? Yeah. But so like the panel puzzles are usually kind of like that in The Witness, and yet so much care is like given to how the puzzles are positioned, how they're made, all that stuff, that it's just like, what? Like, you know? And yet, like,
who's doing
who
this?
would, yeah, you know? So, and it's kind of explained by the VR meta story thing, but like I said, there's layers in The Witness, and it wants to try and make maximum sense on each layer. Again, even if they can't make it make total sense, they kind of want to make it make like metaphorical sense. Yeah, a bit of sense. And so this beautiful theory of some anonymous Redditor is that like, what if the environmental puzzles were like part of the physics of this world? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is a little bit like, I think I've read this. These are going to be the most obscure references you've heard all week, but this is a little bit like the video game Everybody's Gone to the Rapture by the Chinese Room. It's also a little bit like the unfilmed movie script A Topiary by Shane Currith, the director of Primer and Upstream Color. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. But basically in Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, it's like it's a story where you have this observatory, and they find like they like interpret like a SETI message from outer space, but the message turns out to be like a crazy info virus. It's like a living thing, even though it's just information, and it's not like it infects the computer. It's like it leaks out everywhere, like it goes in sound over the phone lines, and then it must like infect people's minds or something. That people like drop a can of paint, and the paint spills and like makes this like butterfly pattern that's like the symbol of the thing, you know? And then like people, you know, like all this like the information just keeps propagating and spreading like a virus, but just through all kinds of different forms, almost like how energy can be transformed from like potential to kinetic to chemical and whatever. So anyways, the idea is like, what if the environmental puzzles were just like, they kept recurring in that way, not like they were a living alien mind like in Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, but like they were part of like fundamental physics, like how I don't know, what's something that, like how electricity is like part of our normal world. Like sometimes there's static electricity, sometimes there's lightning. Ancient people might look at it and be like, wow, I wonder what that is, you know? And then people begin to notice it, right? So it starts out with the people in the desert. And what are they obsessed by? They're obsessed by two things. First of all, they're obsessed by the sun, which is a freaking circle, and they're obsessed with making little environmental puzzle reflection things. And in a way, the sunlight is kind of associated with like the most powerful, like the end game thing that you do to activate the hotel elevator, the hotel portal is like an environmental puzzle driven by the sun, and it's the only one in the game, right? Versus the very first environmental puzzles created by the very first people are like reflecting the sun and also creating this bright, pure white environmental puzzle, the likes of which are nowhere else in the game.
And they have a lot in this area, and it's always like in the sun and then the light.
Yeah. So they're obsessed with the sun. They're obsessed with, which creates these like powerful environmental puzzles, and they're also obsessed with like representation and meta-ness and stuff. And again, kind of like beginnings of language and all that. And so the idea is like, that's kind of the start of it, or I'm kind of maybe pasting in some of this like with my understanding of like the specific places. But the Reddit blog post was like that this was a recurring feature of the natural world. It would just show up, and then people started to notice that over time. It must have been almost hard to notice, even though we think like we'd be like super freaked out if we noticed that. But if you grew up in a world where that just happened all the time, it'd be like us noticing that like fractal patterns recur all the time. Like, oh, it's trees, and it's also like the shape that freaking water makes when it makes a river, you know? And it's also like... the
shape of blood vessels.
Yeah, exactly, you know? And they actually have a little call out to that over in the, you know, that area over there. Yeah. But, you know, it's like, what if there was like a recurrent, you know, if there was just this weird environmental puzzle symbol showing up, it might be difficult to notice. It might just seem like, oh yeah, like that doesn't, the wind just makes that happen. You know, like it's just a recurring thing.
Yeah, that's just how the wind works. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, but then, you know, slowly people would have this kind of dawning realization that like this is an aspect of nature, and it has a kind of, you know, it kind of has to do with the observer, right? Because that's the classic environmental puzzle thing. It's like it lines up with human perspective. It's not like a physical shape. It's not always a circle. It's like an ellipse that looks like a circle from a certain angle, or like some pieces of random different stuff that come together and like fit together to make a shape, you know? So they're doing that. I'm thinking like the desert people start noticing this and kind of worshiping it. Eventually that gets refined into like the monastery, which remember is super like environmental puzzle based. So it's almost like a school for like trying to understand how the environmental puzzles work. They're like, oh, if we look through little pieces of metal that are shaped in certain ways, then we can kind of control the shape of it, or we can create certain perspective situations, you know, that then, you know, lead to certain outcomes. And they're starting to understand that it's not just the sun power, but it has something to do with consciousness and like their own observation, you know? And so then you start to get like this sort of like environmental puzzle worship, or like, you know, environmental puzzle like study and understanding. I closed all these things, but you know, and that's as far as the medieval civilization goes. But then the industrial civilization shows up, and they start to actually be able to manipulate it, just like how we started to be able to manipulate electricity and actually use it to create electronics. Like, these are little environmental puzzles, right? Like, they're lighting up, you know, like, we're using that power. Oh, no, I messed this up. But, you know, we're using that power to be able to create, like, almost like computational elements. Like, what's the joke about, like, we taught sand to think or something by... you know, by creating these computer elements. It's like in the same way that we're like harnessing electricity to first produce primitive electronics and then produce like, you know, like sophisticated computer systems, and maybe like, kind of, God forbid, create like advanced AI that is like far higher intelligence than any human. Like they're like figuring out how to capture this like fundamental aspect of reality that seems to have something to do with like the observer, and it's like tied in with consciousness, in order to literally create little mechanisms. They use it to open doors, to power things, to, you know, do little computations and stuff. Obviously the idea that
they start before the puzzle panels though, right? Because they have all of those gardens where they're like planting things in like color patterns. They're like turning lights on and off.
It's unclear in this crackpot Reddit theory, like, which of those are kind of like intentional, like the shape on top of the monastery, or which are kind of like randomly. Just spontaneous, like they're just gardening and they're like, oh my god, like I was just carving that topiary and then it made that shape perfectly. That's kind of my impression. It's sort of like the infovirus take, rather than the worship showing up in like constant motifs. But yeah, so the idea is that like the industrial age people, and this ties in with like some speculation on like what are the panels, like it's like the glass ones, it's like, you know, we don't have LCD screens that are perfectly transparent and just go between glass. And like over in the monastery, they have these wacky ones that are like weird hollow shapes. And then in the marsh, it seems like they're, and the freaking wires glow with color, which seems a little extravagant. And in the marsh, they're like gathering the juice to like put into the wires, as we talked about in that episode. There's that one area where they have like the glowing tanks full of juice. So it's like, okay, it's some sort of like living bioluminescent ink that they're, you know, it's like not normal electronic, even though some of them look like CRTV screens. So again, it's kind of vague, but the crackpot theory is like, this is like totally not LCD technology. It's like bioluminescent ink sandwiched between plates of glass, and it reacts to like just your attention on it because it's tied in with your consciousness.
I was gonna say, I'm going crazy with this now because I'm like, oh man, like the puzzle must change if you like take a piece of the ship and put it like in front of it or behind it. And
Yeah,
then, like,
yeah,
that
exactly.
will like just cause the puzzle to reform it into something.
Yeah. So people are just running into these all over the place. And then they're slowly building an industrial capacity to like actually master this seemingly random part of natural physics and turn it towards like human industrial ends, right? And then in the mountain, of course, we push it so much further. We create those weird, ugly puzzles that are like going all around at different speeds and stuff, like really pushing things to the limit. I like using the symbols is almost like doing little transistors and like learning how to make them do computations for us and stuff. There was actually some math paper about like, is the witness Turing complete? Like, could you execute arbitrary computations using like puzzle solutions or something? Or like, could you make it arbitrarily complex? Or like, could you make puzzles that could only be solved in polynomial time or whatever? But then in the mountain, you start seeing really the fruits of like hardcore technological investigation, because I mean, I really have only a few pieces of evidence for this, but you get like the light bridges where like you're literally creating an environmental puzzle using a panel puzzle and then like walking across it as like a physical thing that you've created in the world. And then you get like the teleportation thing in here where you like somehow capture the fusion power of the sun or something, or like the kind of pure form of the good energy of the sun, like sort of spiritual energy of it.
The pure form of the circle from the
yeah, exactly. To like, power some sort of magic dimension teleporter or something. And then like I was highlighting in that very starting area how it has the like super simple like black environmental puzzle in like the warp gate where you first are like mist warped into the world. So anyways, that's like the crackpot environmental puzzle theory, is that this is all like a way of like, look at, it's like literally like an electrical thing, and you click it and then it goes like whoosh, like or I guess it's already lit up super bright white, but it's like literally getting the power of the sun, even though it's perspective. It's like a mechanism powered by perspective. So the super civilization is like learning the rules of the world, and then and you get like panel puzzles.
Explain why this is such a weird magic puzzle?
Yeah, this is like a dumb magic puzzle, but like this thing is like, it's like just bright white kind of like sunlight power that's just showing up on like a carved space. It's like they're carving the symbols and turning it into an environmental puzzle, so it's whack is basically what I'm saying. But anyways, so I'm like, what's powering the warp gate? And it's like, it's literally this is powering the warp gate,
This is how you got here.
Yeah.
Did it exist before you did?
Yeah. So anyways, that's the theory, and that helps kind of illustrate the witness's weird thing for like having multiple layers of metaphor and literalness and multiple layers of fictionality. And it also, I think, illustrates like it helps tie together like what the super civilization is all about. They're not just like getting richer and coming up with cool whiz-bang technology. It's like they're really solving the fundamental thing. They are accomplishing this impossible goal. They're like breaking down the wall of paradise and connecting these two worlds that have been totally unconnectable. Just like how the second tallest point in the witness, the tower up here, represents the kind of union of the two free will points. Like the mountain and the coming together of all these energies and like powering this lab is like, that's where they're solving like unifying, like solving the hard problem of consciousness and like understanding the fundamental nature of reality, and thus getting a bunch of like miraculous technology as a kind of side thing out of it. And I guess I would just loop back to say that like this might sound like a very sci-fi story, but it's really pretty plausible. Like, people dismiss as sci-fi things that just feel too weird. I wonder if we can find the meme that's like the exponential graph of GDP, and there's like a little thought bubble from the very top of the graph when things are like accelerating faster than ever, which is like, my life is pretty normal. You know, I have a firm grasp on what's weird versus what's not. And people who are speculating about like space exploration or artificial intelligence or other very strange futures or cryonics are like totally deluded and deceiving themselves. You know, it's just pointing out like this is unusual. Like the situation is objectively weird, you know?
Yeah.
And it might be true that like our world of like nation states and like just people reading their iPhones and playing video games, like maybe that just continues for another 200 or 300 years, and yeah, that would buck a lot of trends. That would imply it's almost like there's no normal future, right? Like if you look at the graph, like we could have like total economic stagnation from now, but like that would imply a bunch of other things going haywire, and like that wouldn't be a normal future either. That would be a future of like conflict and like zero-sum resource depletion and like degrowth and all that kind of stuff. And like if the lines continue, then like that's an even crazier world of like exponential stuff and whatever, you know. And maybe you find some middle path that's like the most normal possible thing, but it's still going to be very weird compared to today. Some things are going to be so much cheaper, other things be so much more expensive. Like, you know, some things we'll know so much more about, other things will be just as stuck as ever. It would feel like a very lopsided world, and like, also, even if our world remains relatively normal feeling for like, you know, another 200 years, that's good for our lives, you know. So maybe I'm like wrong to get like, I'm not super hyped about like space colonization, but like if I was, like space colonization is probably not happening in my lifetime, you know. Like maybe some people will get on a rocket to Mars, that'll probably happen, but like it's not like we'll be like flying around and, you know, having wars between Mars and Saturn or something. Like or like fast and light travel is probably just objectively impossible. So the like that sci-fi stuff is like unrealistic in the sense of like I shouldn't literally expect to see it in my lifetime, and it's probably also unrealistic in the sense that like we'll never have a space opera world, because we'll first create like crazy AI, and even if that goes really well, like it won't look like people just doing space opera stuff. It'll look like people who are like cybernetically enhanced like gods, just like chilling, and then also we're sending von Neumann probes to like colonize the galaxy or something, you know. But it won't be like any picture of the far future is probably really wrong.
Right. Yeah. Like, and even that one.
Yeah, for sure. But like just the idea that like there are a lot of technologies that seem physically possible, like having really advanced brain-computer interfaces that like are able to kind of merge your mind with other people's thoughts, or like building super powerful computer AIs that maybe we could merge with, or you know, even just creating like crazy new types of psychedelic drugs that cause like totally unknown effects, or like using, you know, like there's all sorts of just like neural technology that it seems like there's nothing in physics that says we can't do it. It's just really hard and complicated. And there's all kinds of other technologies that right now there's a bunch of superconductor hype, which will probably turn out to be fake. I don't know. By the time you post this video, you'll know if it was all fake or if the world is transformed. But like, it's like superconductor temperatures have been getting higher for a while now. You know, they found room temperature superconductors that just require really high pressure. I don't know if it's physically possible to have a real convenient like superconductor, but like there might be all kinds of weird nanomaterials that we can make. Like, it seems like, I mean, there's a lot of scary things. Like, it seems like you could create like killer viruses that could wipe out humanity, or like nanoscale machines that could do weird things. But there's just a lot of potential technology out there. And so it's like, in an important sense, it's like not sci-fi. It's just like, maybe it'll take longer than the most sci-fi hyped people are picturing. But like, that's kind of one of the potential futures of humanity, and that's almost more, that's like, it is more plausible than some kind of fantasy normal world that like doesn't ultimately add up. So anyways, so that's like an important part of the optimistic story of The Witness. Is on the one hand, it's saying like we have a lot to learn from the past. Like we should be more aware of our position in civilizational history. And I like how it has this kind of escalation of the height, right? The desert civilization is like this real squat little monument, and then there's like the diversity of stuff in the medieval times, and you know, the town and all that, and and then up to the mountain at this pinnacle. It reminds me of that mural, the Prologue and the Promise by the Disney guy that is like kind of very utopian. But anyway, so the Witness is like quite serious about both like we should pay attention to our place in history and have more of a sense of the long past and a sense of those deep questions that don't seem tractable today, but it's like you should know about them. Like you should, it's like kind of the duty
they haven't gone away.
Yeah, it's like the duty of every human to kind of be involved in that and think about that if you want to sort of, I don't know, take responsibility for your own relationship to the universe or something. But then also this awareness that like things are really happening, and even if we don't live to see it, that there's like more to come. There is the potential to like put some of the pieces together. There's probably a lot of things that we'll never be able to understand, sadly. The Witness is very kind of optimistic and joyful, but there's a good chance like we'll never be able to get physical measurements from like outside the physical universe that we're in, probably,
or even just a limit to how small we can go.
Yeah, exactly, things like that. But we'll always be able to ask like what's outside the box, why, like what made that, yeah. Why. But I don't know, that sort of technological story is a way of showcasing what the goal looks like on a civilizational level, right? For an individual, you might think like, oh, maybe it's like enlightenment, like you just have some amazing realization about the nature of consciousness. But like then it's kind of like, what are we all doing here as humans or something? Or I don't know, like it's the Witness is sort of making a statement about like we're in this kind of diversity world where we're like there's lots of people living different lifestyles, and we basically don't know the answers. Like we don't know why we're here, we don't know what the right way to live is. We don't really know our place in the universe, but like maybe in the future we can learn more and we can like have a totally transformed experience. So anyways, this is getting a little rambly, but like it's just an important like to have that civilizational perspective, and that it's not just about the individual quest for truth, but it's like taking the quest for truth seriously. Like people think it just means being a philosopher, but it's like no, like it really like it gets very sci-fi because we have the capability, and like the mysteries are so big and like so seemingly impossible, like the hard problem of consciousness, but also like we have like an incredible amount that we could potentially do, and we kind of have no idea, just like the people in ancient,
right, like
primitive technology
what's
world,
what's behind the experiment or what's behind the question that we asked, or
yeah, like these people out in the desert, like they didn't know what the stars were, or like where how they evolved or anything like that, and like we've come so far from them, and in the same way it's like impossible for us to imagine how far we could go in the future,
and to imagine that it'll be like the things that we imagine are today. Like for them, like the sun being like this crazy burning thing like a billion miles away, and actually there's like dozens of them. Like that would be hard to imagine. And for us, whatever we think is normal is going to feel like that in the future, where it's just like, holy shit, what do you mean the world is like made out of consciousness or who knows what?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's pretty much it for our video today. Of course, we'll talk about the kind of juicy details of what's in the mountain and some of the other connotations and meanings and stuff at a later time. But that is the kind of civilizational perspective and the lore of the Witness. I think I might do a video with a short story that I wrote that kind of is about these themes of like different stages of humanity, kind of looking back to the deep past and then forward to to the sort of like difficult to comprehend, like uncertain but hopefully utopian future. And we'll do some more stuff about the Witness, and it'll be a fun time. So thanks everybody for coming along. I hope you liked the crazy crackpot theory about environmental puzzles being the literal physics of the island.
Yeah, that was good.
And see you next time on Examining the Witness.